So she was actually put in the position where she was in a room with two men when she'd asked for a female chaperone. So it's not just a little bit wrong. It is sexual assault. It is, quite frankly, disgusting.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. This week, a report has revealed that for the past 10 years, gender has consistently replaced sex when it comes to government data collection. This has caused all kinds of problems, such as cervical cancer screenings, when you are categorising patients in single-sex wards, and even in the prison service. To talk about this, I'm joined by Kellie-Jay Keen, also famously known as Posey Parker. Kelly, thank you so much for joining us on Spectator TV. I think lots of people have been saying that the trans turf war is over, but the report this week kind of suggests otherwise. What do you make of it?
Well, the implications are kind of every aspect of a woman's life, aren't they? When you conflate gender and sex, and I just want to preface this to say I don't believe in gender. I think it's a nonsensical term. It doesn't really mean anything. It means lots of different things to lots of different people, unlike the word sex. And so I find the whole thing very confusing and not helpful, very, very unhelpful. So we should just be recording biological sex. Nothing else is really important. Nothing else is a true indicator of the way humans behave, the sort of trends or the healthcare implications that we have, criminality. All of these things do actually matter based on our sex and actually will inform people based on our sex. But nothing else does, apart from maybe a diagnosis of some sort of condition or another.
And it's quite surprising how pervasive this has become. I mean, people have missed out on cervical cancer screenings, prostate cancer screenings. It's affected single-sex wards in hospitals. Do you think that the NHS, in the way it is now, has been focused on this woke agenda? And in the meantime, we're facing the highest level of cancer wait lists, hip replacements take weeks to be done. Is this just the culture in the NHS?
Yes, in a word, yes, it is the culture in the NHS. I think it's not just the NHS, but every place that kind of puts a focus on this particular issue, like we'll call it trans. Every organisation that focuses on that, I think it's a distraction. And that means that they're not focusing on something else. So sometimes governments might focus on it and, all types of woke. And actually the economy is failing in the NHS. Like you say, there's so many key areas that the NHS is failing. Like to get an appointment with a consultant dermatologist, for example, you're looking at about 6 to 9 months to get just a chat, just an initial consultation. So the fact that the NHS, I looked into it, and I'm going to be conservative and say they spend about £50 million a year just on DEI hires. So this will just be people with diversity and inclusion in their actual job title. So the rest of it just flows from that. But yeah, we waste so much money. It's criminal.
You have to feel sorry for some of the staff working in the NHS and how awkward labelling people must be with pronouns. They've been told not to use Mr. and Mrs. They've been told not to really use the term man or woman. Just a recent case was nurse Sandy Peggy, who complained about a trans person changing in the women's facilities and has had to go through a huge trial. I mean, do you blame the staff?
Do I blame the staff? Yes and no. So Dr. Upton, who is the sort of the focus of the Sandy Peggy case, and I think Sandy Peggy, amazing, fantastic. Thank you very much for actually standing up for yourself. But there will be so many members of staff that have watched that man gaslight patients and pretend that he's female, or forcing others to pretend he's female. Patients who are in vulnerable situations, they might be teenage girls, they might be elderly women, they might just generally be any patient going into that A&E. So I've known for a long time about the danger of staff. We've had numerous stories about men who cross-dress, who are working in the NHS, and the NHS seems to just let them carry on. We know that there was a woman in a psych ward, for example, and it was supposed to be female only. And when she said that man next to me is frightening me, and she was told that's a woman, and on her notes it was recorded that she was a transphobic bigot. That was like back in 2016, 2017. So this sort of infringement, gaslighting, and cognitive dissonance has been going on in the NHS for far too long. And you have to blame the managers who are clearly creating these policies just to kind of have something to do, I think, and to exert some sort of power. But every single member of staff that sat in one of those training sessions and said nothing and gone along with it and then inflicted that on a patient, including a patient recently who was having an internal examination, she asked for a chaperone, and the two people in that room with her was a male doctor and a male nurse who called himself a woman. So she was actually put in the position where she was in a room with two men when she'd asked for a female chaperone. So it's not just a little bit wrong. It is sexual assault. It is, quite frankly, disgusting.
This has actually been going on for 10 years, that according to the report. And just looking at the history of the NHS, there's never really been a policy on how to deal with the issue of people who want to be a different gender.
Well, it's that word gender again. Like I don't even know what that means in this context. Like, what does a different gender mean? Because I just don't think we have genders.
But you have if someone did have gender dysphoria, surely they would have to be classified on medical records.
Well, I don't even think gender dysphoria is really a very helpful term either. I think you have fully grown men claiming that they have something called gender dysphoria when we know that actually their motivations are something quite different. And then you have girls as a response to trauma who might decide that they would rather not be girls anymore. And sometimes that's because they're autistic or because they don't fit in with their peers, or there's been some sort of sexual abuse. But I just don't think gender dysphoria is helpful either. What do we do with somebody who goes into hospital and expects a duty of care and compassion from the nurses and the clinicians that they come into contact with? Well, I don't think that a man who pretends to be a woman should feel any less included or any less well looked after if he's on a men's ward. And there are mixed wards, and there are female-only wards, and there are male-only wards, and then there are single occupancy rooms. So there's plenty of spaces already for people. Like there will be people that aren't appropriate to share with other people. There will be people that go into hospital that are pretty terrible people who aren't fit to share a ward with other people. I'm sure we make accommodations for them.
It has been interesting looking at the NHS website because it says there's been a recent development in which there's an introduction of two questions now. So it's, what is your gender identity, and does your gender identity match your sex assigned at birth? If you were running the NHS, Kelly, would you just remove that then? And
whenever any woman in this country goes under anaesthetic, she is entitled, or by law, I think, but certainly in practice, there is always a woman in that theatre with her. And I learnt this because I recently had some surgery, and I asked if there would be a woman, and they were like, yes. Well, as a woman going under anaesthesia, you have a woman often in the room, always in the room. And I think we can all gather that that's because women are at risk of sexual assault by men, even when those men are doctors and surgeons that we see in the NHS when we're in our most vulnerable positions. So this idea that anything else matters is frankly just insane.
yes, and the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, said about this report, the Sullivan Review underlines the importance of recording biological sex, not just for research and insight, but also patient safety. Doing so does not prevent us from recording, recognising and respecting people's gender identity where these differ. We'll act on the findings. So you wouldn't be in Labour's camp when it comes to their policy on gender, sorry, I said the word again, ideology.
It's all right, you carry on. I wouldn't be in anyone's camp who like to validate fictitious identities, no. I think we're in this situation now where I cannot guarantee when my daughter goes out into a public space where there is an assumption that there is a female only space. I can't guarantee to my daughter that there won't be men in there. And furthermore, I can't guarantee that the man in there, when she complains about him being in there, will be removed because he will actually have more of a right to that space than my daughter. So it's a thin end of the wedge. I've been talking about this since 2016, and it's the same argument. If you allow any of these things to have any importance in the, I don't know, public policy, whether it's the NHS, the police, like anywhere where my tax money is funding that particular service, if you, which means you can't opt out, right? Most people can't opt out of the NHS. They can't afford to go elsewhere, and elsewhere is equally as bad. So these places that you don't have a choice, I think the government has an absolute duty to take this ideological nonsense out of it completely.
And it seems so shocking, doesn't it, that the issue of trans rapists going into women's prisons still exists after the Sturgeon row, where the rapist Isla Bryson was moved from a women's prison to a man's prison.
So I'm just going to pick you up on all of the confusion when we use the language of your question. So, and I mean this in the most
Go for it.
pleasant way possible. So when you use trans prisoner, right, I don't hear man. Like people listening don't hear man. People in the prison service don't hear man. Everybody sort of thinks that there's this category of, you know, nearly a woman or a subset of woman or a subset of something, but they don't hear man, which is why some of these men are in women's prisons. So that's why language is really, really important, because once you start capitulating on any of it, once you say trans woman, once you say trans, any of these things, you really do lose sight of the genuine facts of there is a man who's raped a woman who is now in a women's prison. If you say it like that, it's far more jarring and makes far less sense than if you say there is a trans rapist. So that's why I've really stuck to language for these last sort of this nearly a decade, because it's in those kind of opaque sentences and meaning that we lose sight of what really we're talking about.
I hear you, Kelly, but the rates of people with gender dysphoria is not going to start dropping anytime soon, one would suggest, just by looking at how much it's been growing now. And so just being pragmatic, what are people supposed to do if someone says to you, I don't identify as a man or woman? Do we just ignore that?
Yes, we do just ignore that. Yes. Just like if I said I'm a black woman, or I'm Chinese, like we would ignore that we would think that was insulting, offensive, and quite ridiculous. So yes, we do. Yes, we do just ignore it because it's not true. In addition, the premise of the question is that gender dysphoria exists and that gender dysphoria is the motivating factor. Like, let's say it exists. I don't really think it does. I think it's a name for something where someone is disassociating, and often it's a name for someone who has a fetish. And I think most grown men who claim to be women are driven by fetish. And I'd probably say all, but I'll just hedge my bets and say most. And that's not the same thing for women and girls. And maybe grown women are driven by some sort of narcissism, but also girls can be, it can be a response to trauma, as I said before. But the rates of the fact that something is growing means it's less likely to be true. Because where were these, if it's a true thing, where were these people 10, 20, 30 years ago? Well, they didn't really exist, and they certainly weren't growing exponentially. So I think Trump has the best idea, which is just cut it all out of government. No more federal funding in the United States for any of this nonsense. And I think we do well to do the same over here.
A few years ago, I think it was last year actually, we had you on with Richard Tice, who at the time was the leader of Reform. And we thought perhaps you could have a political alignment with the Reform Party. Maybe they would agree with you on the trans policy, gender policy. I don't know what you want to call it. Is there any party that you align yourself with, or are you still going at it alone?
Well, I did form Party of Women to answer that particular question, so we could have the conversation. I mean, as much as I think I am the next Margaret Thatcher, I don't think I'm going to be controlling the country anytime soon. But I think they make all the right noises at Reform. But I just wonder, really, I don't know if many men truly get it. I mean, I hope they do, and they'd be well advised to take counsel from me at any point that they so desire. But when it comes to any of these parties, they don't really get it. But maybe Reform is closest. But Party of Women is created to deal with that question. We come out of the European Court of Human Rights. I'd like to scrap the Equality Act, and I'd like to scrap the Gender Recognition Act. I think those three things are the foundation upon which all this pack of lies has been created. This terrible structure of fiction.
Well, what about Kemi Badenoch? I mean, they all sound like you both align.
No, we don't. I think Kemi she's heading in the right direction, but she's a politician first and foremost, and I'm an activist, and so I'm not limited by having to appease people, which is something that I'm very, very proud of. I'm not in the business of appeasing anyone. I just want women and children to have their rights and their safeguarding not eroded. So when it comes to Kemi, I think she's sort of talked about, I'm very pleased to support trans rights. And I'm just thinking, well, that's a bit of a platitude. And what are trans rights? By the sounds of it, trans rights encompass the right for a man to be in the space where my daughter is. So,
Kellie-Jay Keen, thank you for joining me on Spectator TV.